Hey everybody, welcome Doug Paget Radio with the talking here with Bruce Epperly. Bruce is a good friend to many of us, a good friend of the show, and the author of the book Finding God in Suffering, A Journey with Job. Hey Bruce.
It's good to be here today.
Oh, right on. And tell us where you are in your wonderful almost sort of post-retirement years.
Well, I hope it's not post-retirement. I've got a few days left in me.
That's
Good
true.
Lord gives me energy every day.
Yeah.
But I live on Cape Cod in Centerville, and I'm pastoring a church, South Congregational United Church of Christ in Centerville. So if you happen to be taking a holiday on Cape Cod, come visit us during the week or on a weekend. We're right near the beach, so you can go to church and then go swimming.
Pretty fancy living. So how does somebody living in on the Cape have the gumption to write a book about suffering and finding God in suffering? Isn't the Cape Cod like the ideal place for a person to live?
Well, it sure is, but the mortality rate still remains 100% out here, and I have a handful of cases of folks with serious cancer here on the Cape in my congregation. We deal with addictions and the diminishments of age. And, in many ways, as one of my teachers once said to me, life is risky business. No one gets out alive. And almost every week, somebody brings up to me the question of suffering or pain and how they can gain some sort of divine solace in the course of it.
Yeah, and what I think is great about your book, there's a couple of things I want to recommend the book for to people. One is I think it has a very fresh perspective on Job and that narrative, and talk about that. I think it's got a good perspective and fresh perspective on thinking about suffering, which is also good. And it's also brief, like it's a short enough book that you could read it and really find, someone can make their way through it. So because so many books are just too long. In my view, and I've written a bunch of those that I think are just too long. But there's something about this book that has the right kind of pacing to it and the right length to it. So talk a little bit about Bruce, how you were thinking about suffering and finding God in it, because for some people their big question of suffering is always around, could there be a God, or is there a God? Like it gets into the questions of the nature of their belief about God. But this, your book really leads people into a different way of thinking about suffering and their interconnectivity with God, more so than just kind of the how do you explain the notion of God in a world that's full of suffering?
Well, I think so, because I think as a pastor, my first question and first response to people who are in trouble is to listen and to try to understand what they're experiencing and how can I respond in a healing way. And suffering's inevitable. The only way to avoid suffering is to die on your first day of life.
Yeah.
And so
that doesn't include the suffering of the vaginal canal too, right?
Right. Some suffering is necessary, the suffering that's caused by the fact of evolution, that we're complicated creatures that can do wonderful things and also do some pretty heinous things. Some suffering comes from the fact we're growing. I've got toddlers and a young preschool grandchild, and they're facing something new every day, and they're trying to adapt to it. But the reality is, where do we find God in suffering? Usually people think of God as being the cause of your suffering, or God's punishing you with these events, or it's God's will, or it's a test. What if in the midst of suffering that God doesn't want and we don't want, God's still present, not as a force out to get us, but a force that's trying to provide healing and wholeness in the midst of suffering, and inviting us to embrace our pain, knowing that God is with us. I'm always reminded about Psalm 23, which says quite clearly, even though I go through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. There's no getting around of it, some of it. And without using simplistic explanations or blaming the victim, how can we find some sort of growth or spiritual edification in the necessary trials of life?
And you choose to use the frame of the ancient book of Job as your way into that conversation. For a lot of people who don't remember Job or kind of only know like, oh, he's the guy that suffered, or maybe they know like he had those bad friends. Some people's view of Job is like, hey, look, at the end, God just gets to do whatever God wants, and the point of Job is, yeah, you're going to suffer, but God's got another plan, so stop worrying about it. But you see Job in a much more dynamic and rich way than that kind of just let God be God and don't worry about suffering.
Isn't that the truth? And I think the final editor of Job, or the final author, it appears like the book evolved over a century or more, had that in mind. I'll just review the story if you don't mind.
Sure, no, I think people would appreciate it, yeah.
The story begins with a conversation in heaven between God and God's eyes on the planet, Hasatan, who apparently walks around the planet observing humankind. This isn't the Satan with the pitchfork, or this isn't the devil who's been cast out from heaven. Here, Satan or Hasatan is actually a divine employee, sort of like the prosecutor or the one who's just observing for us. And God makes the statement, Job is a righteous person. And then Hasatan says, but what if you take everything away from him? He's been walking on easy street. What if you take everything away from him? And so God and Hasatan get into kind of a contest about Job, and Job's the innocent sufferer. Now, Job doesn't know about this contest, so he's sort of like us, who in the middle of life, when everything's going well, we think we're gliding down the highway, but as Paul Simon says, we're slip sliding away. And so in the midst of life, suffering happens. We don't know where it comes from or how it came to us. And Job has some friends who visit, and they listen for 3 days until Job starts complaining. Because Job has done everything by the book according to his religion. According to his religion, if you do all the right things, you're going to have a glorious life. If you do the wrong things, you're going to suffer. And so all of a sudden they start talking, and it becomes a theological tennis match in which each of the characters, in a way, represents a theological position of acts, consequences. We could call it the prosperity gospel now, in which if you do the right things, life will be wonderful. And Job's not having a wonderful life. He must be at fault. And so it goes back and forth and back and forth. And then no resolution. It even gets so complicated that in their Hebrew, you don't even know who's talking. The voices are raising. Everybody's angry. And, of course, Job's friends have some skin in the game. If Job is doing all the right things and he's suffering, then nobody's safe.
Because to their mind, Job had played the game the way the game was supposed to be played, and now look what's come to him.
Job is perfect. By their standards, he should not be experiencing this. He needs to do something wrong and repent. But Job can't do that, because if Job repents, he's confessing he's done something wrong, and he's done nothing wrong.
Oh, interesting, yeah. He's
in a catch-22, as the saying goes.
Yeah. And so like the way you take the book of Job, which I like a lot, is that it's this participation of God, and not this continuation of these sets of rules that if you follow them, then you're on the good side of God, or on the good side of the universe, or on the good side of karma, or any of that stuff. Whatever words you sort of put around the economy keeper in a religious system. But you say no. The book of Job doesn't even call for that. So why do you think it is that for so long, like if Job's one of the older books, even in the Old Testament canon, so it's been around a long time.
Yep, that's for sure.
Why do so many people still hold those views that suffering is because someone does good or does right, or sort of eats the right thing, or does the right kind of spiritual practice or whatever? When there's like this ancient narrative that's trying to say, no, the story is something completely different. Like, how come this idea that you're purporting in your book, Finding God in Suffering, isn't more well established in people's minds?
Well, I think it's scary for us, myself included, if there's no absolute guarantees.
Mm.
If, in fact, of the matter is you do all the right things and it turns out wrong. How many times has the President of the United States, not just our current President Obama, but others say, work hard, play by the rules, and you'll succeed?
Oh, he says that all the time. That's
And
the deal.
he's right for most of us. Obviously, you can't have a society without acts and consequences in some order.
Yeah.
I know people who've worked hard, played by the rules, lost their jobs, and had their homes foreclosed.
That's right.
I know people that have eaten the best diets and took off jogging one day. No, don't worry about this, Doug.
Oh boy.
You're
Oh
immune.
boy. Here we go.
And dropped dead, right? And it was the day after their physical pronounced
Yes.
them in the fittest
That's right.
of health. I've known people that have done their best and followed all the rules, read all the self-help books, had faith like a mustard seed, and they still have had a tough time. And of course, Jesus never guaranteed any of this either. Remember, Jesus said the rain falls and the sun shines on the good and ill alike. And then what do we do with a faith that doesn't give us absolute guarantees and doesn't put us in control of our destinies, but leaves us at some level at the mercy of events outside ourselves? And people like to have God responsible because at least the order of the universe is preserved.
Yeah, boy, and see that, and that's what I think something that you're injecting in this book. And so people who are interested in this conversation, I think will find you as a good partner in this, because even if, like as you suggest, you take the Jesus story and you're like, well, I don't think in the Christian narrative you have anyone with sort of more righteousness than Jesus.
Yes.
And what happens to Jesus is grand suffering, right?
Yes.
Now, and I know a lot of people want to place another narrative over the suffering of Jesus so that it's not that story, so that, well, he wasn't really suffering normally. It was just God was working out some grand economy, for the forgiveness of sins. So Jesus was just, a willing partner in that. But I don't think that's the primary way someone should understand the Jesus story. So that's what's curious to me, is how much resistance there is from religious people who hold to things like the Book of Job or the Gospels of Jesus or any of these, to still tell the story. I mean, there's still this propensity to want to tell the story that people are that there's a one-to-one correlation. When I got into Christianity, it was by evangelicals who introduced me to Christian faith, and there was one of the groups I was with. They produced a little booklet that they used to hand out, and the start of the booklet that was called "The Four Spiritual Laws" said,
Oh, yes.
just as there are physical laws that govern the physical universe, so are there spiritual laws that govern your relationship with God. And then goes law 1, 2, 3, and 4. And that whole notion, right, that no, look, there's just like laws and there's rules and this is how it works. And like that perspective, people really want that. They really want that. I mean, I say formulaic here in sort of a derisive way, but a lot of people like those formulas. Like, no, hang on a minute. Like, you do this, you punch this code, and this is what happens in the end. But the thing you're describing is like this cold-hearted chaos universe, So how do you find good news of God, or the partnership of God in a world that, as you put it, is connected to these random events? Or
well, yes. Yes. Does God play dice, as Einstein asked that question? Yeah. And Job has an answer, and I have an answer too, and we might even be right. You never know.
Yeah.
But the answer to Job is an interesting one, and at first glance it can be read as being God's the cosmic bully, because after all the conversation is ended, God steps up and shows Job this majestic universe. And
and then says something like, "What did you make all this? Like, who are you?"
Yeah.
Boom, Yeah.
But interesting aspect of it is the majestic universe, and we live in a majestic universe. I revel at the seashore on Cape Cod and the cranberry bogs and the ponds out here. And I go online to watch the Hubble telescope photos. We live in a majestic universe, and it's also a wild one. So in the course of showing Job how wonderful the universe is and how we are just small parts of it, God introduces 4 creatures, a warhorse, an ostrich, Leviathan, and Behemoth. And each one of them represents something really interesting. The warhorse is all passion. And passion is is something even God has to deal with, the war horse and Leviathan and Behemoth, and it takes a lot for God even to control these. And then there's ostrich, which is just simply a creature, as Job says, that the book of Job says, that steps on its eggs and is sort of aimless in what it does. Almost to say to Job, this is a wonderful universe. Life is beautiful. You should rejoice in it. Yet within the wonder, there are pockets of chaos. The same body that produces T cells and our ability to talk to one another may also have cancer cells. The same voice that sings hallelujah may also get angry at the drop of a hat. The same creativity that creates the MRI creates the atom bomb and goes into stores and newspapers and slaughters journalists. So I think it's a wild world that God even have to contend with. And I don't think Job is denying order. He's just simply saying within this grand order of the universe, in which most things are going in our favor, canst thou control the gravity after all? We don't have to think about the spinning of the earth. Amidst this, there are also pockets of chaos in every moment of experience. And God deals with the chaos too, trying to bring about the best possible world.
So those four animals, there was the horse, passion, the ostrich, the aimless, and then the behemoth and the leviathan. What do they represent?
They're just simply wild and almost barely controllable. They're barely controllable. They go where they want. They do what they want.
Yeah.
And God has brought forth an evolutionary process that such beings exist. But there's an inherent freedom and randomness in the universe that doesn't make life fully predictable. And I guess that's the problem that people have when the self-help book doesn't work, when the prosperity gospel doesn't work, when the New Age law of attraction doesn't work, when we really aren't creating our own realities, is the fact there's unpredictability in the universe. And that's scary. And for Job, maybe at the end of the day, the once God starts speaking, perhaps Job realizes that out of the whirlwind, Job has the ability to call out to God and enter dialogue, even enter a controversy with God, that eventually God responds to. Now, this is a narrative. This is a legend. We don't know if there ever was a person named Job. But the story is certainly our story of every woman and every man.
And so for people who know you already, they would know that you have, you're quite comfortable and want to have a Christian understanding of the world that embraces chaos and the participation of God in the process of the world, as opposed to someone who frames the Christian faith as, well, God's doing something and we're just pawns in that larger scheme, and we're not really generating with God. God's the ultimate designer, controller, maintainer of all things in the world. That you want to see a Christian faith that articulates a story that fits better with the biblical narrative, like in Job and other places in the Bible, but also fits better with what we know about the nature of the cosmos as a whole.
Yeah, I think that we aren't in control of everything, but I think in the course of the evolution of the universe, we have gotten the ability to become companions with God. We have our own spheres of freedom and agency that are congruent with God's freedom and agency. The other options, frankly, are to my mind worse. Let's use the notion of John Calvin's and the Calvinist predestination. They're quite comfortable with God being utterly sovereign, but the utterly sovereign God has predestined some to salvation and others to damnation. You're damned if you do, damned if you don't. I take exception to Rick Warren, although I'm very appreciative of Rick Warren's work. I respect him. But when he says God has planned all the important details of your life without your consent, that includes your family of origin, your intelligence, your gifts or lack thereof, or even the fact that your family was loving or brutal. Warren's an honest theologian, an honest preacher, so he admits that, and that these are ways in which God observes to see if we can make lemonade out of lemons. The drawback of that is that so many fail. The drawback is so many fail, and they fail and then have the ultimate punishment for failing, which is going to hell. And so does God, when somebody says God plans your family of origin, that's good if you have pretty darn good parents. But if you have brutal parents, you think, what are you thinking of, God? Are you sadistic?
Well, so that's one of the things that comes up in the book of Job, though, right? Is because in that narrative, you have this conversation in heaven, and then God says, well, I'll just start taking these things from Job. So I can see how people, though, who have that view would say, well, it's precisely what the book of Job is about. The book of Job is saying God gets to determine what people have and what they don't have, and God is simply testing them. So how do you think about that story, the content of the story in relationship to what you're...
Well, yes, and I think Job is really inviting us to challenge that viewpoint. Many people think, as you well know, Doug, that the Bible has one voice all the way through. So every verse in the Bible squares with every other, and good Lord, the gymnastics they have to do to make that be the case. Most scholars, and I agree with them, believe that Job is thinking of Deuteronomy and the notion that those who succeed obviously have done good works and are loved by God, and God's rewarding them. Those who fail are being punished. And I think Job is challenging that viewpoint, and he's also challenging a certain arbitrary image of God just doing as God pleases. I think that Job may not give us the final answer, but a little bit like Socrates, the Greek philosopher who claimed that he was able to say all the wrong answers and wasn't quite sure what was right, but he knew the ones that were wrong. Job is doing the same thing. So Job doesn't have a problem with good works and doesn't have a problem with their acts' consequences as long as they aren't absolutized. I happen to agree with parts of the prosperity gospel that indeed our faith makes a difference. But is our faith omnipotent? I don't think so. I have prayed for countless people that they'd recover from cancer. I go to the mercy seat, as we used to say in the evangelical church, praying for them, and sometimes they die. Now, I think my prayers make a difference, but they're not omnipotent, and that's the problem. I also believe there's something to be said for the New Age notion of people's thoughts shaping reality, but I can tell you so many people that have been guilt-tripped, as we used to say in the 60s, by people who said, well, you've still got cancer. What negativity are you holding on to? Or they'd say, a little bit like this odd passage from John's Gospel, the man who's born blind, who sinned? The parents or the man himself that he's born blind, and Jesus doesn't weigh in on it except to say that's wrong in this case. And then he says, well, darkness is coming. Let's work while it's still light, as if to say the best response to suffering is not to tell people why they're in this mess, but to help them out and help them find ways to help themselves out.
Well, Bruce, thank you for being on the show. The book is Finding God in Suffering, A Journey with Job, a terrific book for groups to read together, don't you think, Bruce? I know that's some of what you thought.
Individual, group, church, people who are seekers. It's not a book that's doctrinaire, and so I hope a person who might call themselves a seeker or an agnostic, folks ask those same questions, and my goal is not to pour into their experience something that they have to believe, but to invite them on a spiritual journey.
A Journey with Job, Finding God in Suffering. Bruce Epperly, thanks, buddy.
Thank you so much.
Hey, stick around, folks, on the podcast for other shows, The Tick, The Talk, The Take, all that from Doug Badger Radio. Thanks for listening.